Hello, ladies and gents. We're on module A328 on infant use today. Young teenagers, mature teenagers, young adults, mature adults, OAPs. It's bored and out of horizon. If you feel bored, you lack of things to do, pick yourself up a book, endeavour into education. Education is very important, isn't it? Block 3 is concerned with how empires work, with the drivers and mechanisms that sustain empires one established. These mechanisms express and reflect the flow of power and agency over time. Units 8 and 9 have four grounded different types of power: military, political, and bureaucratic, economic. These are obviously important to any understanding of how empires worked, but to concentrate exclusively on such factors misses the role played by ideas, systems of knowledge, culture, and ideology. This unit considers how these less tangible influence also help to sustain imperial systems. Drawing on Edward Said's notion to the enterprise of empire depends upon the idea of having an empire. I argue that what people thought and believed in both metropoles and colonial contexts help to sustain empires. Surely you might say ideas or cultural products reflect rather than cause more tangible real world developments. I would argue the opposite: how individuals perceive the world and their place within, and the knowledge they use to interpret the world and produce the cultural products that reinforce group identity are the main drivers of their actions. It might be helpful here to consider the concept of habitatus as developed by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. Habitus is best understood as a socialized norms of tendencies that guide behavior and thinking at an unconscious level. If we accept that we all have lasting dispositions or trained capacities and structured propensities to think, feel, and act in determinant ways, shared with people of similar backgrounds, then the importance of abstractions like ideas, knowledge, and culture to the maintenance of empires become more apparent. This unit explores some of the ways in which ideologies and cultures contributed to the maintenance and function of empires. It focuses primarily on the British and French empires initially. You will consider imperial ideologies. How did authors, thinkers, and opinion formers in metropoles write? And what did they believe about others around the world? What role did this play in creating imperial mindset? A set of assumptions that justified and allowed certain types of actions in colonial contexts. We'll explore this via the overview in section 1 and then go online to complete section 2, which is activity based. Empires were not simply top down structures of domination, but rather a complex interplay of ideas and cultures in both colonial and European settings. Consider, for example, figure 10.1, illustrative of the mixture of cultures that occurred in imperial settings. This portrait shows an English merchant wearing Ottoman style clothing and posing in a manner that was not prevalent in England at the time. The unit therefore also explores hybrid and resistant colonial cultures, the ways in which imperial ideologies encountered and interacted with local cultures to produce unequal accommodation as well as cultures of resistance. These accommodations and resistances also played a part in maintaining empires. Again, you will study this via the overview in section 3 and then go online to complete section 4, which is activity based. The unit ends with a consideration of gender, which is used to demonstrate the way in which cultures and empires were never homogeneous but were always cut across by a host of different identities. Imperial ideologies, the overview. As you learn in blocks 1 and 2, empires have taken very different forms in different historical periods in different parts of the globe. Arguably, however, all empires are underpinned by what we might call imperial ideologies. What do I mean by this? A handy definition from the Encyclopedia of Empire is given here below. Imperial ideologies are ideas, concepts, explanation, and justification for empire and imperial societies, which have articulated for themselves. They are the means by which dominant imperial societies make sense of how they acquired an empire, why they continue to maintain an empire, and what form and shape their empire might take in the future. They are the worldviews of imperial societies. They have formed the base of how imperial societies have sought to organize their empires politically, socially, and economically. Another term for this is, which we have encountered in Unit 3, is the imperial imaginary, a broader concept that refers in the ways in which the ideas shape kinds of social relations and institutions that were conceivable or plausible in specific situations. Burbank and Cooper. For example, the belief that those living in the metropole are somehow a superior group was often to legitimate claims to ownership of resources, territories, or people. The term ideology and imaginary of broadly interchangeable. The key thing to remember is this: historians agree that it is important to understand of empires to consider the ideas, perceptions, and assumptions that help them to function. They were not post facto rationalists of the empire, but underpinned their acquisition and maintenance. For the section 1, it introduces aspects of imperial ideologies. Section 1.1 will introduce you to some of changing justifications used to legitimate empire, as well as some of the metropolitan resistance to them. Section 1.2 will trace imperial ideology within broader a system of knowledge, such as a scientific discourse and the law. Section 1.3 will consider whether ideas and about empires permitted whole populations or were restricted to certain groups. Activities in this section will be reflective, encouraging you to think through some of your assumptions about power and knowledge. Section 2 of the unit will guide you through some more detailed study of these issues via activities that draw on historical sources. Broadly speaking, in the period of 1750, empires were often viewed in the metropolitan context as natural modes of social organisations. Prior to the age of nation states, of course, it was not unusual for one social or ethnic group to rule over another. Early imperial endeavours on the part of European countries were thus justified by a range of different ideas and concepts. Spanish colonialism, for example, was legitimate in part of the bulls issued by Pope Alexander, which gave the crown the right to occupy the Americas in order to convert the indigenous population. The English justified their conquest of Ireland in the same way. Alongside religious justification, some theorists debated the concept of terra nullius, empty land, the idea that undeveloped territory, any unexploited land, whether it contained people or not, could legitimately be taken and ruled. While his position has often been simplified, John Locke's second treatise of government certainly began with the idea that if the lands were occupied but undeveloped, not farmed or built upon, then nobody has originally a private dominion exclusive on the rest of mankind. Rather, if a European were then to arrive and work in land whatsoever, then he removes out of the state the nature has provided. He has mixed his labour with, and thereby makes it his property. Crucially for Locke, the development of land had to be combined with the enforcement, usually by some form of the state, private or private property. Thus, if Europeans arrived somewhere without established government, in their view, but then impose a state, they could claim such land for improvement. Alongside this, a third strand of early modern thinking of empire developed, and this embraced an idea of a secure civilizing mission alongside drive to religious conversion. For example, noted to prosperity, no greater glory can be handed down than to conquer the barbarian, to recall the savage and the pagan to civility, to draw the ignorant within the orbit of reason. The idea developed that different populations were at different stages of civilizational development, for example, savage, barbarian, and civilized. More advanced populations, such as those in Europe, had a duty to lead less developed populations for their own good. These three strands of imperial ideology, religious, legal, and ethical, were used to justify and legitimate a range of acquisitive activities in the Americas and elsewhere. Activities that often involved the egregious use of force. For this reason, as early as the 16th century, a few European missionaries and jurists were making distinctions between legitimate and illegitimate forms of imperial power, condemning Europeans' assaults on indigenous societies and questioning an empire's right to take land and labour from conquered peoples. Burbank and Cooper. Bartolome de las Casas, for example, opposed Spanish expansionism, having witnessed the boldness and the unreason of those who count it as nothing to drench the Americans in human blood and to dispossess the people who are the natural masters and dwellers in those vast and marvellous kingdoms. By the 18th century, clear critics of the empires were being developed in Britain and France too. In Britain, Adam Smith articulated a moral and social theory that was broad-minded in its analysis or unfamiliar societies and practices are careful to avoid presumptions of European cultural or moral superiority. In France too, the whole notion of empire was similarly contested at times. Denis Diderot described his fellow citizens who sought to claim a right over their fellow men, telling them that instead of recognising this man as a brother, you only see him as a slave, a beast of burden. It's important to realise, however, that these critics were not necessarily questioning the acquisition of empires per se, but more the manner in which imperial endeavours were being carried out. In other words, it was the violence and injustice with which the imperial civilizing mission was being undertaken that was being critiqued and questioned, and not the very idea of a civilizing mission itself. For about 1830 onwards, in both Britain and France, increasingly sophisticated justifications of empire developed. Some of these were still based on what have been termed stadial theories of development, the idea that different populations were at different stages on the common journey towards the supposedly advanced state of civilization represented by European countries. These ideas of empire still included discussion of racial difference, perceived cultural or biological dissimilarities between populations, but the difference was generally seen as either cultural or a result of the environment. Bethencourt. As the 19th century progressed, however, new and supposed scientific ideas about race come to the fore. These focus more overtly on the division of humans into distinct and largely immutable racial categories, with an increased focus on the biological makers and determinants, as Esme Cleal has noted. These shifts have been widely read as a hardening in racial thinking because they occurred alongside and as part of an intensified intolerance of difference and a quickening of colonialism. Not everyone agreed with these new biological ideas of race. Some believers in the civilizing mission, particularly those inspired by religious or missionary beliefs, rejected the idea that race difference was immutable, but political or philosophical justification for imperialism certainly become intertwined with the development of racist theories of biological difference, which further justify imperial rule. Carl, works by Robert Knox, 1791 to 1862, Arthur D. Gobineau, 1816-1882, both of whom promoted the view the cultural difference stemmed from the birth of ancestry rather than from environment. By the late 19th century, therefore, both the French and British empires were sustained by ingrained assumptions of racial difference and cultural superiority, combined with the mission of statutory civilizing mission to the point that it was entirely unexceptional for the Prime Minister of France. Jews ferry to state that superior races have a high vis-a-vis the inferior race become they have duty towards them, they have duty to civilize them. While race was never a clearly defined or agreed conception in the metropolitan discourses, its increasing definition in biological terms and its presentation as something natural rather than socially constructed lent it power to justify and inform some of the worst colonial aristocities, although such ideologies of empire were often publicly expressed in a paternalistic and neutral terms. It is important to realise the significant real-world consequences they had in the first place. The notion of the hierarchy of nations and the civilising missions underpinned political and military leaders' efforts to make we, they, or self other distinction between them, colonising and colonised populations. You may recall the politics of difference that were briefly discussed in Unit 3. Creating and maintaining difference, including radicalised difference, meant colonial states exerted great effort to segregate space, provide people from the metropole with a home away from home. It prevented colonial agents from going native and regulate sexual relations between different populations, as well as structuring the real world operation of empires. These ideologies also legitimated the significant violence inherent in all European empires, as Caroline Elkins argues. Violence enacted on bodies, minds, souls, cultures, landscapes, communities, and histories was intimately connected to the civilizing mission developmentist dogma. In other words, it wasn't just the structures of colonial rule that shaped coercive systems and practice, it was liberal imperialism ideology as well. At this point, we might be thinking, so what is if some white men wrote complicated justification for empires a long time ago? Did this really have an impact on how empires worked? Well, John Stuart Mill on Liberty, in which he claimed that less developed nations like India would often benefit from rule by more civilized nations like Britain, was reprinted 6 times in his lifetime, and contemporaries described it as producing a profound impression on contemporary thought and being an extraordinary success with the public. But as hinted at the end of the previous section, there was a more significant way in which writings that justified empire had real-world impact. The discourse of difference proposed by such texts based on the notion of a hierarchy of civilization and a range of perceived racial differences. This becomes so commonplace as to the largely unquestioned. It simply formed part of the European habitus, the unconscious propensities to act and feel in certain ways that shaped the ways Europeans acted in imperial contexts. This raises a further question, however. Clearly not everyone in Europe, nor even a particularly large percentage, would have been aware of published texts, musing on empires and civilization. So how did the imperial ideologies, the powers become embedded into broader systems of knowledge and popular consciousness, so as to have real world impact? This is a complex question, so I will focus here on 3 concrete examples: laws and legal codes, scientific texts concerning marital races, and political discourse. Early imperial endeavours could take place extra legally, but generally, once established, empires needed laws, and penal codes enabled them to be governed and managed. The earliest laws and legal codes that developed in colonial context applied only to European subjects residing in those areas.